Hello, and welcome back to another episode of 280 Characters, where we delve into what part social media plays in the hot topics of today. As always, I'm your host, James Andrews, Strategy Executive at Twitter, and this episode is devoted to how young people engage in climate activism. Today, I have with me Zali Stegel, MP for Warringah and co-chair of Parliamentary Friends of Climate Action.
Thanks for having me.
Clement Chinesky, a professor of cultural studies at the University of Sydney.
Good to be here.
And River Parker, young adult fiction author and youth activist.
Howdy all.
I'd like to open the discussion by asking why it is important to consider the function of social media when we're contemplating climate activism. Zali, would you like to start us off?
Social media has provided young people with a totally new way of engaging with politics. For Australians under 25 who've never voted for a Prime Minister who has served their entire term and who have seen their climate concerns neglected in policy, they're increasingly disillusioned with politics. So in this context, I think social media provides an accessible form of non-electoral political participation to young people.
I really like what you're saying this, Ali. Young people taking to social media to explore different political identities. Furthering that, I'm really impressed by social media's ability to introduce people to different ways of approaching topics, especially across cultural boundaries. It's wonderful for helping us understand each other on a real grassroots level the world over.
Okay, but just from a writing perspective, social media is fascinating because in past generations, the way that we communicate is separate to the literature we create. Social media is a literary form that's created for immediate consumption, especially in activism. Young people like me, we're creating resources which are meant to directly and immediately engage their audiences with a political purpose.
Yeah, River, this is definitely where I see social media as differentiated from traditional forms of political protest. The ability to communicate immediately and to personalize that communication in both content and in those interactions gives social media a huge strategic potential for young people to coalesce and share political information.
Thanks, guys. Speaking from Twitter, we've definitely observed the voice of young people on our platform and their ability to use it in new and innovative ways. We've seen a rise in the spreading of information, and as much as we try to stop it, the miscommunication about protests before and after they occur. However, I'm going to have to leave that section of the conversation there and keep this going with another question. So now, with social media activism evidently being seen having a significant increase in participants, I'd like to throw that question out there. And if you'd like to start us off, River, do you think that social media climate activism has been real or had tangible results for climate discourses?
Yeah, of course. Of course, social media is real and has an unprecedented role in the way that we as young people, we shape activism.
Look, I agree with you that social media activism has been incredibly real for its participants, but it's easy to exaggerate the extent to which that it's actually been transferred into policy impact. Speaking to my colleagues and thinking of how policies actually get made, it's pretty self-evident that the hashtags and online petitions of social media activists just aren't as persuasive to representatives as in-person protests and electoral political participation.
I agree with bits of both of what you guys are saying. Yes, Zali, people have to talk the talk and walk the walk for activism to be impactful, and there can be a lot more talk on social media sometimes. But if you think more on what River's getting at, then you can think of an example like Greta Thunberg. Shows us how social media can cross international borders and make real, meaningful change at every level of society, from the political all the way down to the individual.
Yes, agree with that so much, Clem, but I don't think the impact of social media can be undermined even if they don't walk the walk. I think we need to understand social media is a different form of literature than perhaps we classically define it, but it's literature all the same. Literature is ostensibly authenticated by its ability to impact its receivers and, by extension, the cultural zeitgeist. I mean, what are the differences between a TikTok and a political feature film? The intention is the same.
Yeah, in terms of information sharing and issue salience, I think it definitely has a part to play. I think the climate strikes last year were clarifying for both policymakers and the public, raising awareness of the intergenerational debt created by adults' climate inaction. But you can see how politicians typically are more concerned with the issue preferences of more powerful interest groups than engaging with social media activists typically have a short attention span and no formal leadership.
I think there's a greater problem we can tap into from there, Zali. We have to remember that we can't just speak in an Australian context either, or even a Western one, as if the social media apps we use are there for every person around the world. Some people don't have social media at all, and there are other big platforms too. Think of Russia and China as great examples. We need to be aware of social media activism's limitations and account for them.
I think you've all made some really great points that feed into this whole concept of prosumers on our social media platforms. So that way the youth today continue to produce this media and consume this media around that online activism. So many studies have actually documented a positive correlation between the increased use of social media and individual participation in protest. And social media platforms such as Twitter can facilitate these global discussions needed around the importance of activism and changes in legislative policy. Just before our final question today, so a few quick facts that Twitter has a market cap of over $23 billion US dollars, around 500 million tweets every single day, and about 22% of adults use the platform. With all of that being said, I'd like to ask you all whether you can make any predictions for social media's future significance. Zali, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, I think that the full strategic potential of social media is as yet underdeveloped, but is becoming more and more obvious. The UN Secretary General called a climate summit in September 2019 in direct response to the youth climate strikes. Though politicians still have a tendency to disregard youth activism, as more politicians like me get on the Twitter, social media protests may start to have a real bearing on climate policy. To reach that potential and persuade reluctant policymakers, I think social media activism does have to develop bipartisan participation and sustain its momentum in the long term.
Look, I'm incredibly optimistic about social media, both currently and in the future, being a primary form of activism. I mean, social media activism isn't about the direct production of policy. It's about giving an outlet for young people to show the overwhelming fears, anxieties, and most of all, priorities of their generation, just like every other activist writer has done.
I'm both optimistic like you, River, but a bit cautious about what social media will bring to the future. I believe it has astonishing potential to group people across the world, something we really need to see with climate change. But it's prone to mob mentality too. If the groups we see form in social media succeed in incorporating the range of voices that need to be incorporated, it will be a wonderful boon to our world. But if it instead creates echo chambers that become more and more exclusive and divisive, social media activism could collapse under its own weight.
Personally, as one of the newest forms of communication, I'm really excited to see how social media platforms like Twitter continues to evolve this climate change activism that we've been discussing today. Thank you all to our guests for an amazing discussion. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy days.
Thanks for having us, James.
For all you listening at home, don't forget you can continue this conversation on our website and on our socials. And thank you for another episode of 280 Characters. Tune in next week where we discuss boys and feminism.